The morning she showed up at the Callaway auction, the sky was the color of old pewter, and the men standing by the fence posts went quiet in that particular way men do when they're deciding whether to be cruel or just indifferent. She was 29 years old, dressed in her late husband's work jacket, and she was holding a bidding number like it was a grenade. Nobody expected what happened next. Before we get into this story, I need to ask you something. If everyone around you decided you didn't belong somewhere, how far would you go to prove them wrong? Because the woman in this story didn't argue. She didn't cry. She didn't explain herself. She just climbed into the saddle. If you've ever been underestimated, or if you've ever watched someone rise from a moment that should have broken them, drop your city in the comments right now and tell me. Would you have gotten on that horse? Like this video, subscribe if you're new, and let's go back to the morning everything changed in Harlan County. The town of Drywater, Texas didn't have much to recommend it beyond its stubbornness. It sat in a shallow valley between two limestone ridges, the kind of place that looked like it had been dropped there by accident and then forgotten. The main road ran through it like a crease in old leather. One gas station, one feed store, one diner that served coffee so thick you could stand a spoon in it. The nearest city was 4 hours east, and most people in Drywater had never found a reason to go. What Drywater had, above all else, was land, and the people who owned it. The ranching families had been there for generations. The Callaways, the Pruitts, the Hargrove brothers. They knew each other's bloodlines the way they knew their cattle's, by memory, by reputation, and by the quiet arithmetic of who owed what to whom. Land passed through sons. Deals were made on handshakes at the feed store counter. Women managed households, raised children, kept books sometimes. They did not, as a general rule, run cattle operations on their own. Nora Sinclair had understood this perfectly well and had always considered it someone else's problem. She had married Garrett Sinclair 6 years earlier, coming from Abilene with a college degree in agricultural science and a practical turn of mind that Garrett had loved immediately. He was a steady man, careful and unhurried, and together they had built something real on the 300 acres his grandfather had left him. Not the biggest spread in Harlan County, not the most profitable, but theirs. Garrett died on a Thursday in late October, a heart attack at 41, on the south pasture, alone. The paramedics found him near the fence line. The cattle were still grazing around him when they arrived. Nora buried him on the ridge behind the house, in the spot he'd always said had the best view. Then she sat at the kitchen table for 3 days and did not move much. On the 4th day, she got up, fed the horses, checked the herd, called the bank, and started doing the math. The math was not good. Garrett had taken out a loan the previous spring to expand the herd, a calculated risk that made sense at the time. The payments were manageable when he was alive and able to work the full operation. Now, with hired hands she could barely afford and cattle prices that had slipped again, the numbers told a story she didn't want to hear. She had 2 options: sell the land at a loss, or find a way to build the operation into something that could sustain itself. There was a third option: accept the quiet offers of help she'd already received from Dale Callaway, who had been eyeing the Sinclair acreage for 15 years and saw in Garrett's death an opportunity wrapped in a condolence card. Nora didn't consider the third option for long. What she needed was stock. Specifically, she needed working horses, trained cutting horses that could handle serious ranch work, and she'd calculated that 2 good animals would let her run the operation with 1 less hired hand, saving enough per month to stabilize the loan payments through the next fiscal year. The Callaway auction was the best place in 3 counties to find that kind of horse. It was also, as she was about to discover, the worst place in 3 counties to be a young widow who showed up alone and intended to be taken seriously. She had known Dale Callaway most of her married life. He was 62, thick-necked, with the particular confidence of a man who had never once been told no by anyone whose opinion he respected. He had 3 sons, Rex, Cole, and the youngest, Bo, all of whom had inherited his certainty without quite inheriting his shrewdness. When Nora pulled her truck into the lot that morning, she saw Dale standing with Rex and 2 of the Pruitt men near the main arena entrance. He saw her too. He said something she couldn't hear. The others laughed. She parked the truck, pulled on her gloves, picked up her bidding number, and walked toward the gate. What she didn't know yet, what none of them knew, was that the auction would not go the way anyone expected. Not because of the horses listed in the catalog, but because of the one horse that wasn't supposed to be there at all. The auction grounds smelled the way they always did: hay, manure, diesel from the tractors, and the particular sharpness of nervous animals in close quarters. Nora had been here before, always with Garrett, always standing slightly behind him while he talked to the men who mattered. She knew the rhythms of the place. She knew which pens to check first, which sellers had a reputation for misrepresenting soundness, which animals looked better than they were. She moved through the grounds methodically, clipboard in hand, checking the catalog numbers against the horses in the pens. The first 2 horses she evaluated were acceptable. Neither was exceptional. Pen 7 held a sorrel mare that showed well in the catalog but moved with a subtle hitch in the left hind that the seller, a man named Ferris, was clearly hoping no one would notice. Nora noticed. She noted it on her clipboard and moved on. She was standing at pen 11, watching a gray gelding work through a basic lead change, when she heard the footsteps behind her. Nora Sinclair. Dale Calloway's voice was the kind that carried. He had cultivated it over decades of doing business in open spaces. She turned. He was flanked by Rex, who was 34 and built like a refrigerator, and a man she didn't recognize. Younger, maybe her age, with the look of someone who worked outdoors but wasn't from around here. "Dale," she said. "Didn't expect to see you out here." His tone was the careful kind of unkind, friendly on the surface, testing underneath. "Things settling down for you?" "Working on it." "Good, good." He glanced at her clipboard. "Looking at horses?" "That's generally why people come to horse auctions." Rex made a sound that might have been a laugh. Dale smiled with half his face. "You know, if you're having trouble managing the operation, there are people who could help. Wouldn't be anything shameful about it." Garrett was a capable man. Running that place alone is a different situation. "I appreciate the thought," Nora said. She turned back to the gray gelding. There was a pause. Dale wasn't accustomed to being turned away from. "You ever work cutting horses yourself?" he asked. "Without Garrett, I mean." She kept her eyes on the gelding. "I trained 2 of the ones we have now." The sound was skeptical without committing to skepticism. "These are working animals. They need someone who can actually ride them out in the field, not just around an arena." She said nothing. "I'm just saying," Dale continued. "A woman managing that place alone, buying working horses, it's a lot. People might wonder if you know what you're getting into." Nora turned back to face him. She kept her voice even. "Thank you, Dale. I'll keep that in mind." He held her gaze for a moment, trying to read whether he'd landed anything. Then he nodded, said something quiet to Rex, and the 2 of them moved on. The younger man, the one she didn't recognize, lingered a moment longer. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite categorize. Not pity, not amusement, something closer to assessment. "Don't let him get in your head," he said quietly. Then he followed the Callaways. Nora stood still for a moment. Then she wrote a note on her clipboard and kept moving. She found the horse in pen 17. He wasn't in the catalog. That was the first strange thing. The pen held a single animal, a dark bay stallion, maybe 15 hands, with a blaze that ran wide down the center of his face. He stood at the back of the pen with his head low and his ears moving, not in panic, but in a particular kind of focused attention, like an instrument tuned to a frequency no one else could hear. The tag on the gate said, "Exhibition only. Not for sale." He was magnificent. That was the only word for it. The muscles in his hindquarters were coiled and defined. His coat was the deep reddish brown of old mahogany, and his eyes, when he finally lifted his head and looked at her, were the color of amber with something behind them that felt startlingly close to intelligence. Nora stood at the gate for a long time. A handler came by, a young woman with braids and a harried expression. "He's not in the auction," the handler said. "Please don't feed him." "I know. I'm just looking." Nora studied the horse's movement as he shifted his weight. "Whose is he?" The handler hesitated. "That's complicated. Try me." The handler glanced around. "He belonged to a man named Whitfield. Chester Whitfield. He passed about 6 weeks ago. There's a dispute about the estate. His nephew brought the horse here because he didn't know what to do with him, but he can't sell him until the estate clears probate. So he's just here. Exhibition. What's his name?" "The horse?" "Cassidy." Nora looked at Cassidy. Cassidy looked back at her. "He won anything?" she asked. 3 regional cutting championships," the handler said, her voice shifting slightly, the involuntary tone of someone who respects something. "He was Whitfield's personal horse. Not a sale animal, ever." Whitfield trained him from a foal. Nora wrote the name on her clipboard. "Thank you," she said. She went and watched the auction. She bought the gray gelding, the one with the clean movement, for a fair price, after confirming on second evaluation that the hitch she'd noticed earlier was old scar tissue, stable, not progressive. She let the sorrel mare go to Ferris's cousin for more than she was worth. But she kept thinking about Cassidy, and about the nephew who didn't know what to do with him. His name was Owen Whitfield, and she found him eating a sandwich alone at one of the folding tables near the concession stand, looking like a man who was trying very hard to be invisible. He was in his mid-30s, with the slightly soft hands of someone who worked in an office and the slightly lost expression of someone who had recently been handed a problem he hadn't asked for. He had his uncle's last name and, apparently, very little else in common with Chester Whitfield, who by all accounts had been a ranching man to his marrow. Nora sat down across from him. He looked up, startled. "I'm Nora Sinclair," she said. "I was looking at your horse." He blinked. "Cassidy. That's the one." Owen Whitfield set down his sandwich. He had the look of someone who had already had 3 conversations about Cassidy that week and hadn't enjoyed any of them. "He's not for sale," Owen said. "The estate. I know about the estate. I'm not here to buy him." She paused. "Not today." He studied her. "Then what are you here for?" "Information. And possibly a conversation about what happens to Cassidy when the estate clears." Owen rubbed the back of his neck. "Look, Mrs. Sinclair. Nora. I don't know what you've heard, but I'm not a horse person. I'm a structural engineer from Dallas. My uncle left me his property because I was the only family he had left, and I honestly don't know what I'm doing with any of it, including the horse. What do you plan to do with the land?" He was quiet for a moment. "Probably sell it. It's 140 acres. I can't manage it from Dallas. And Cassidy?" "I was thinking," he stopped. "I don't know. A rescue, maybe. Something responsible." Nora nodded slowly. "Can I ask what he's worth?" "Appraised." Owen told her. It was more than she could spend right now. Significantly more. "Here's what I'd like to propose," she said. "When the estate clears probate." "How long?" "My attorney says 3 to 4 months. When it clears, I'd like to have a proper conversation about Cassidy. About whether there's an arrangement that makes sense for both of us. Not a rescue. Something that respects what your uncle built with that animal." Owen Whitfield looked at her for a long moment. "Why?" She considered her answer. "Because I watched that horse for 40 minutes this morning, and he's not a rescue horse. He's a working horse who's been stood still too long. And I have land and work that could use an animal like that." Something shifted in Owen's expression. Not quite trust, more like the beginning of interest. "You'd need to ride him first," Owen said. "He doesn't take to people easily since my uncle died." "That's fine. I mean," he paused. "He threw the last 2 people who tried." "I understand." He looked at her steadily. "You don't seem worried." "I'm plenty worried," Nora said. "I'm just not going to let that stop me." She gave him her card. He gave her his. They shook hands across the folding table in the way of 2 people who have just agreed to something that neither of them is entirely sure about. She drove home with the gray gelding in her trailer and Cassidy's name written on her clipboard. And that night, she sat on the porch in the dark and looked at the ridge where Garrett was buried and thought about what it meant to ask something of an animal that had lost the person it trusted most. She understood that more than she wanted to. The weeks that followed were the hardest kind of ordinary. The ranch didn't stop for grief. It never did. The cattle needed feeding, the fences needed checking, the books needed balancing. Her hired hand, a taciturn man named Vince who'd worked the property for 4 years, did his job without complaint and without warmth, which suited Nora fine. She didn't need warmth. She needed competence. She rode the new gelding. She'd named him Flint because of his color and his temperament, and he was good, solid and responsive, with the calm reliability of an animal that had been well started and carefully developed. He would do the job. But she thought about Cassidy. She heard things about the horse through the networks that moved through small ranching communities. Whispers, really, passed along at the feed store and at the diner. That he'd refused to load for the farrier. That he'd stood at the fence for an hour watching the horizon the week after he arrived at the auction grounds, as if waiting for someone. That he'd bitten Rex Calloway's hired man when the man tried to handle him roughly. That last one she filed away without comment. Dale Calloway called her twice in those weeks. Twice she listened to his careful suggestions about the property, the loan, the difficulty of operating without a partner. Twice she said she'd think about it, and hung up. She didn't think about it. What she thought about was the loan, and the numbers, and the specific morning 3 months from now when Owen Whitfield's estate would clear and she would need to be ready. She called her bank. She restructured the payment schedule. She sold 12 head of cattle she'd been planning to overwinter and used the proceeds to extend her runway. She cut costs in ways that were uncomfortable and necessary. She started teaching riding lessons on the weekends, something she hadn't done since before her marriage, because the income was small but real. And she rode. Every morning, sometimes before full light, she was on Flint or one of the older horses, working the south pasture, reading the land the way Garrett had taught her, and before that, the way her own father had, in a different part of Texas, a different kind of ranch. She understood, becoming something. She wasn't sure yet exactly what. The call from Owen came on a Thursday, which seemed to be her day for things that changed everything. "Probate cleared," he said. 2 days ago. "That's faster than you expected. My attorney is unusually competent. I thought I'd call before anyone else made an offer." A pause. "There have been 2 already." She stood at the kitchen window, looking at the pasture. "Anyone I'd know?" "A man named Calloway." "Of course. What did you tell him?" "That I'd think about it. Which is what I'm doing." Owen's voice had a careful quality. "Nora, before we talk numbers, I need to tell you something about Cassidy." She waited. "He's been getting worse," Owen said. "Not dangerous, exactly, but withdrawn. He won't work. He barely eats. The vet says there's nothing physically wrong with him." She used the word grief. Nora closed her eyes for a moment. "Yes," she said. "The vet suggested that what he needs is a specific kind of rider. Not just a competent one. Someone with," she said, "quiet hands and patience." She said if he doesn't find that within the next few months, he may never come back to what he was. A beat. I believed her. "What did Calloway offer?" Owen told her. It was a fair market offer. Maybe slightly above. Calloway had the money and the motive. A horse with 3 cutting championships was a piece of prestige, even if he never worked the animal. "I can't match that number," Nora said honestly. "I know, but I can offer you something Calloway can't." "What's that?" "I'll get on that horse." Silence. "Nora, I know what you said. I know he threw the last 2. I'd like to go out there and spend time with him first, not riding, just being with him. A few days, if you'll allow it. And then if you and I think it makes sense, we talk about a purchase agreement with terms that account for the difference in price." "What kind of terms?" She'd been doing the math for weeks. "A payment structure over 18 months. Plus, if I can bring him back to working condition, I'd like to enter him in the Harlan County cutting competition in the spring. If he places, I'll pay you a bonus above the agreed price. If he doesn't, you lose nothing beyond the time value of the money." Owen was quiet for a long moment. "You've been thinking about this for a while," he said. "Since the day I met you at the auction." Another silence. "Then, come see him Saturday." She drove out to the Whitfield property on Saturday morning, a small ranch in the eastern part of the county that had the particular sadness of land that knew it was about to change hands. Owen met her at the gate, looking slightly out of place in new work boots. He walked her to the pasture where Cassidy was kept apart from the other 2 horses on the property. The horse was standing at the far fence. His head was low. He didn't turn when she approached. She didn't approach. She sat on the top rail of the fence about 30 feet away, and she stayed there. Owen waited. "Are you going to?" "Not yet." She sat for an hour. Owen eventually wandered back to the house. Nora sat. Cassidy didn't move for the first 40 minutes. Then, in the slow and particular way of horses who are paying attention while pretending not to, he began to shift. A few steps to the left. A pause. A few steps toward the center of the pasture. Not toward her. Not exactly. But no longer with his back fully turned. She came back on Sunday. And Monday evening after she finished her own work. On Wednesday, Cassidy walked toward the fence. He stopped 6 feet away and stood looking at her with those amber eyes, his ears moving in the way that meant he was reading her. She sat still on the rail. She didn't reach out. She didn't make a sound. After a while, he took 3 more steps. His nose was close enough that she could feel his breath on her forearm. She still didn't move. He stood there for a long time. Then he turned and walked back to the far fence. Owen had been watching from the porch. When she climbed down from the rail, he came over with 2 mugs of coffee and handed her one. "What was that?" he asked. "The beginning," she said. Word got around, the way things always did in dry water. By the second week of Nora's visits to the Whitfield property, people were talking. Not kindly, in most cases. The version that reached the diner counters and the feed store floors was something like, "The Sinclair widow is making a fool of herself over some horse she can't afford and can't ride." In the Callaway version, which Dale was not shy about sharing, it was a matter of practicality. The woman was clearly not managing her grief. Someone should step in. He, Dale, was willing to pay fair market for her property and Whitfield's, and the whole messy situation could resolve itself cleanly. Nora heard these things in fragments, because small towns are porous in that particular way. She logged them the same way she logged weather, as conditions, not judgments. She kept going to see Cassidy. The ride started on a Thursday, her Thursday, 2.5 weeks after her first visit. She had been grooming him for 4 days by then, working slowly, talking in a low voice about nothing in particular. He had stopped flinching. He had begun, in the cautious way of an animal reassessing its opinion, to accept her presence. She saddled him quietly. He shifted once, turned his head to look at her, then stood still. She mounted. He didn't throw her. What he did was freeze, completely, absolutely, every muscle locked, for approximately 30 seconds. And then he exhaled, a long and shuddering breath, and his muscles released all at once like a fist unclenching. She sat him through it. She didn't move her hands. She waited, and then she walked him forward, and he went. She rode him for 20 minutes that first day, just walking, just asking for basic responsiveness, turning, stopping, yielding, and he gave her everything she asked for with a precision and lightness that made her chest ache. Because this was not a horse learning something new. This was a horse remembering. She rode him again on Saturday, and again the following Tuesday. She started adding work. Light lateral movements. Lead changes. The beginning patterns of cattle work. Cutting fundamentals, reading movement. The specific athleticism that made a great cutting horse something close to a partner rather than a tool. Cassidy was extraordinary. She had trained good horses. She had ridden excellent ones. But there was something in Cassidy that operated at a different frequency entirely. A combination of instinct, training, and whatever it was that exceptional animals have that cannot be taught or bought or bred for reliably. An uncanny quality. A presence. She began to understand what Chester Whitfield had built over years of patient work, and she felt the weight of it. Owen came out to watch one afternoon. He stood at the fence with his coffee and watched her work the horse through a pattern in the open field. And when she came back to the gate, his expression had shifted into something she hadn't seen on him before. "He looks like himself," Owen said quietly. "Close," Nora said. "Getting closer." Owen nodded. He was quiet for a moment. "I've decided," he said. "About the price." She waited. "Your terms." 18 months. "The bonus if he places." He paused. "There's one other thing I want." "What's that?" "I want to come watch the competition. In the spring." She looked at him. There was something in his face that she recognized. The expression of someone who has just decided to care about something they hadn't planned on caring about. "That's fine," she said. They signed the papers the following week at Owen's attorney's office. Dale Calloway heard about it before Nora was back in her truck, because that was the kind of county it was. He called her that evening. She didn't answer. The winter came down hard on Harlan County, the way it did some years. Ice storms that locked the roads. Mornings so cold that water in the stock tanks had to be broken by hand. Nora worked through it. She worked because there was no alternative, and because work, she had discovered, was one of the few things that kept grief from becoming its own kind of weather system inside her. She rode Cassidy 5 days a week, weather permitting. On the days she couldn't ride, she groomed him, or sat in the barn with him, or simply stood at his fence and let him read her the way he liked to. Vince, who was not given to sentimentality about animals, watched Cassidy work one afternoon and said, without preamble, "That's a horse." "Yes," Nora agreed. "You going to compete him?" "Harlan County Spring. May." Vince looked at the horse for a moment. "Dale Calloway's going to enter Rex." "I know. Rex won last year." "I know that too." Vince said nothing further. He went back to work. But she noticed, in the days that followed, that he started coming by Cassidy's pen in the evenings, sometimes bringing an extra flake of hay. She didn't comment on it. The Harlan County Cutting Horse Competition was held on the third weekend of May, in the large arena south of town that smelled of sawdust and rosin and the specific anticipation of something about to be decided. It drew people from 4 counties. It was not a major circuit event, But it was serious. 3 days, multiple divisions, real prize money in the open class, and the accumulated attention of everyone in the region who knew what a cutting horse was and what it meant to produce one. Nora had entered the open division. This was the one Dale Calloway considered his territory. Rex competed every year in the open. He was a competent rider with a solid horse and the unflappable confidence of a man who had never seriously imagined losing. When the entry list went up and Nora Sinclair's name appeared on it, with a horse listed simply as Cassidy, bay stallion, the response in the arena office waiting room was a particular kind of amused silence. "She's going to ride Whitfield's horse?" someone said. Apparently. Against Rex. Nobody said what everyone was thinking. They didn't need to. Nora arrived early on competition day with Cassidy in the trailer, Vince driving, Owen Whitfield sitting quietly in the passenger seat looking like a man doing his best not to show that he was nervous. She had brought nothing extra. No luck rituals, no ceremony. She had prepared. She had done the work. Either it was enough or it wasn't. She walked Cassidy through the grounds carefully, letting him read the new environment, the crowds, the arena sounds, the cattle in the holding pens. He moved well. His ears were up and active, his eyes calm. He was not a horse that spooked at noise or crowds. Chester Whitfield had prepared him for exactly this. She saw Dale near the main arena entrance. He saw her. He came over, and she noted, without surprise, that he had the Pruitt brothers with him. An audience. "Nora," he said. He looked at Cassidy. Something moved briefly across his face, recognition, maybe, of what he was looking at. But he composed himself. "Big day for you." "For everyone," she said. "You know." He tilted his head slightly, the paternal gesture she'd come to recognize. "No one would think less of you for riding the green class. This is your first competition since Garrett. The Open it's a different animal. No shame in starting somewhere more appropriate." She looked at him. She thought about the 6 months of early mornings. She thought about Cassidy's first exhale in the saddle. She thought about the bank, the loan, the numbers she had built and rebuilt. She thought about Garrett's handwriting in the margins of the old pasture maps. She thought about the question people kept asking, in different ways, in different voices. "Can you?" "I'll see you in there, Dale," she said. She walked Cassidy to the warm-up area. She was the 5th rider in the open class. Rex Calloway rode second. He was, she admitted to herself, good. His horse was a well-trained sorrel with a correct, mechanical style, precise without being brilliant. The crowd appreciated it. Rex tipped his hat when he finished and sat looking comfortable. When Nora's number was called, the arena went through a shift that she felt in her sternum. Not hostility, exactly. Something more complicated. Expectation mixed with skepticism, and underneath both of those, the particular suspended attention of people who aren't sure what they're about to see. She rode Cassidy into the herd. She let him settle for a moment. He was still, focused, reading the cattle the way she'd felt him read everything. With that uncanny precision, that attentiveness that bordered on something deeper than instinct. She dropped the reins. Cutting horse competition requires the rider, once they've selected their animal, to drop the reins onto the horse's neck. From that point forward, any use of the reins means disqualification. The horse works entirely on its own reading of the cattle. The rider's job is to stay balanced, stay out of the way, and trust. She dropped the reins and trusted. What Cassidy did in the next 2.5 minutes was difficult to describe to anyone who hadn't seen it. The cow he chose, a quick, unpredictable roan, broke hard to the left, and Cassidy dropped his hindquarters and cut with it so cleanly that there wasn't a sound in the arena for a moment. The cow tried to turn back to the herd. Cassidy mirrored every movement with a speed and economy that made the air feel different. This was not a correct, mechanical style. This was something else. Nora sat perfectly still. She breathed. She moved her weight with him in the way she'd spent 6 months learning, and she felt Cassidy read the cattle, read the moment, read everything, and respond with a precision that Chester Whitfield had spent years building into him, and that the last 6 months had, somehow, restored. When the buzzer sounded, the arena was quiet for 1 full second. Then it wasn't. She rode Cassidy out of the arena to a sound she had not expected and didn't quite know how to receive. Genuine, unambiguous appreciation from people who knew exactly what they had just seen. Owen was at the gate. His expression was completely unguarded. She dismounted and stood next to Cassidy and patted his neck, and didn't say anything at all for a moment. Vince appeared at her elbow. He handed her a water bottle. He said, "Yep," which was the most she'd ever heard him say about anything that wasn't work-related. The scores came out 90 minutes later, after all 12 riders had competed. Rex Calloway placed third. 2 other riders scored above him. Nora Sinclair placed first. She was standing near the trailer when they announced it, and she heard her name and felt something move through her that she could not have named. Not triumph, not vindication, though it was those things. Something older and quieter. The feeling of having done a thing you weren't sure you could do, and discovering that you could, and carrying the knowledge of that going forward. Dale Calloway did not come to say anything. Rex walked past her on his way out. He stopped. He looked at her for a moment. His expression was not what she expected. "Good ride," he said. She nodded. "Thank you." He walked on. Owen came over. He held out his hand. She shook it. "I think my uncle would have liked you," he said. She didn't trust her voice entirely, so she just nodded. Cassidy stood behind her, calm, eating hay from the trailer's net, his sides slowly rising and falling. The drive home was quiet in the good way, the kind of quiet that sits in a cab between people who have shared something and don't need to explain it. Vince drove. Owen sat in the middle. Nora rode the passenger side with the window cracked, watching the limestone ridges go gray in the evening light. She called her bank on Monday morning. The prize money, combined with the bonus clause Owen honored without waiting for her to ask, made a dent in the loan that she felt physically, like setting down something heavy. The numbers told a different story now. Not comfortable, not easy, but possible. The specific kind of possible that meant she could keep going and not be afraid every time the phone rang. She kept Cassidy. She worked him through the summer, not competitively. He'd earned rest, but functionally, using him in the way he was designed to be used, moving cattle, reading land, doing the 1,000 small things that a good cutting horse does on a working ranch. He was better at it than any horse she'd ever ridden. And he seemed, in the particular way of animals who have found their right place, content. She noticed changes on the ranch in the months that followed. Vince started arriving 15 minutes earlier than his scheduled time. He never mentioned this, and neither did she. He began, quietly, to take on tasks she hadn't asked him to, small maintenance things, fence repairs that would have waited until she noticed them. She paid him more when she could. He accepted without comment. The riding lessons she'd started in the winter grew into something. She had 12 students by September, mostly the children and grandchildren of local ranchers who wanted their kids to learn properly. 2 of the mothers had been in the arena at the Harlan County competition. They didn't say anything about that directly, but they signed their kids up. Owen called in July, not about business. He was thinking, he said, about keeping the Whitfield property instead of selling, about finding a manager for it, about whether there was someone in the county who might have an interest in consulting on its development. She told him she might know someone. The someone was herself, but she made him work out that implication on his own, because she had learned in the last year that there was value in letting people arrive at obvious conclusions without being handed them. He came back to Drywater in August, stayed a week, and spent most of it asking questions she was happy to answer. He was learning something about ranching the way she had learned something about grief, slowly, incompletely, with a lot of backward steps, but moving forward overall. She found herself liking him more than she had expected to. Dale Calloway was quieter now, not silent. He still attended the same events, still worked his land, still talked to the men at the feed store. But he had stopped calling her. She suspected this was as close to an acknowledgement as she was going to get, and she accepted it. The land was hers. The horse was hers. The operation was hers. She stood on the porch one evening in late August, the hour when the light in Texas goes amber and long, and looked at the ridge. She talked to Garrett the way she had gotten used to doing. Not often, not dramatically, but honestly. "I'm figuring it out," she told him. The wind moved through the grass below the ridge the way it always did, that sound that Garrett had always called the ranch breathing. She listened for a while. Then she went back inside. The following May, the Harlan County cutting horse competition returned, as it always did, to the arena south of town. Nora entered the open again. She entered it knowing things she hadn't known the year before. Not just about the competition or the county or the people in it, but about herself. About what grief and stubbornness and a great deal of early morning riding could build in a person, if a person was willing to let them. She brought Cassidy, who loaded into the trailer like a professional and rode with his customary quiet attention. She brought Vince, who drove without being asked. She brought Owen, who had been in dry water for 2 weeks by then and who wore slightly less new boots than the year before. She brought 3 of her riding students, 2 girls and a boy, aged 9 to 13, who sat in the stands with their parents and watched with the focused attention of people learning something, which was the best thing you could do in an arena. Rex Calloway was entered again. His horse was better this year. She could see it in the warm-up, the improved responsiveness, the tighter movements. He had worked. She respected that. There were 12 riders in the open. There were several she didn't know. 2 from outside the county, 1 from a ranch she'd only heard of by reputation. A young woman who couldn't be older than 20 and who sat her horse like she'd been born there. Nora watched all of them. She watched the way she'd learned to watch everything on the ranch, not with comparison in mind, but with attention. When her number came up, she rode Cassidy in, and she let everything she'd built over the past year sit with her in that saddle. The early mornings, the loan payments, the fence post conversations with Vince, the students who were learning to trust their horses, the months of building something real out of something broken. She dropped the reins. Cassidy worked. He worked the way he always worked, with that quality she'd never found quite the right word for. Not mechanical, not simply athletic. Something that felt, when you were sitting him, like being trusted in return. When the buzzer sounded, one of her students, the 9-year-old, a girl named Petra, stood up in the stands. Nora heard her shout her name. She looked up and found the girl in the crowd, her small hand waving wildly, her face completely open with the particular joy of a child watching something she now knew was hard and good and possible. That was the thing she would carry longest from that afternoon. Not the score, which was high. Not the placing, which was first again, by a margin that would be talked about at the feed store for a month. Not the handshake from the association chairman, or the ribbon, or the moment when Rex Calloway nodded at her with something close to real respect. What she would carry was the 9-year-old's face. The undeniable proof, broadcast across a crowded arena, that someone who was watching had learned something true. This was what it meant to persist at something. Not to win, though winning happened, but to make the thing visible. To stand in the place where people expected you not to be and be there anyway, and let the fact of your being there do its own quiet work on everyone who saw it. Cassidy ate his hay on the trailer ride home. Owen fell asleep before they reached the county line, which she found quietly funny. Vince drove in his customary silence, and somewhere on the back road, with the early stars coming out above the limestone ridges, he turned on the radio. Country, low, and she sat with the window cracked and the warm air coming in and let the sound of it fill the cab. She thought about Garrett, not with the sharp, specific grief that had lived in her chest for the first year, but with something older and gentler. The way you think about someone who shaped the person you are now and therefore lives on in what you do with your hands and how you treat your animals and what you're willing to stand in the cold for. She thought, I wrote him. And yes, sometimes the cruelest questions aren't the ones meant to wound you. Sometimes they're the ones that simply reveal what you're made of. Can you ride? 3 words. Said with laughter. Said by men who had already decided the answer was no. Who had looked at her jacket, her age, her grief, her gender, the size of her loan, and done the arithmetic of other people's limitations the way some people always do. She hadn't argued with them. She hadn't proven anything in the moment they asked it. She went home. She fed the horses. She did the math. She sat in the dark and let grief be grief without asking it to be less. And then she got up in the morning and she went to work. That is the whole story, really. Everything else, the auction, the horse, the competition, the places and people and complications, those are the texture of it, the particular shape this story happened to take. But the story itself is simpler and older than any of that. It's about what happens when someone decides that the answer to a question about their own capability isn't going to be given to them by the people asking. Nora Sinclair didn't answer the question, can you ride? By arguing. She answered it by riding. And in doing so, she changed something, not just for herself, but for everyone watching. For the 9-year-old in the stands. For Owen, who learned to love a piece of land he hadn't expected to. For Vince, who was already loyal and didn't need the proof, but found something in it anyway. Maybe even for Dale Calloway, who had the grace to go quiet in the end. She changed what was possible, not by fighting the world's opinion of her, but by quietly, persistently, building something real inside it. That's the kind of story this is. If it reminded you of someone who got up when they should have stayed down, who rode when people said they couldn't, leave their name in the comments. This video is for them. Like, subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.